Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to this, our sixth episode in this series of REBT Master Class. This is the final episode. And for that, I said I would do a demonstration of the actual REBT model. And I have Dr. Peacock on, who's friend, and volunteered. Don't know what he's really going to be talking about, but we will do a short session as best I can. And then if you have any comments, any questions or comments, feel free to make them in the comments section, and then we will read those as soon as we are done with the session. We won't interrupt the session to take comments. But again, thank you. And I do have an announcement at the very end about something that will be upcoming. So let me say thank you, Dr. Peacock, for coming in and volunteering to be a volunteer and let me demonstrate how we use the REBT session. I'm going to do kind of a traditional one without much variation on it, because people have studied it or heard about it for the last 5 sessions, and now I wanted to put it all together to show them. Okay. So what's bringing you in? What would you like to be looking at today?
All right. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate the opportunity to be present here. So I was going to say I'm anxious about Dr. Johnson, but the thing I've actually been finding myself worried about and anxious a lot about is I have 2 teenage boys, and that alone is enough to make any person anxious. But my son, my oldest son, is very concerned about his future. And he said with technology, AI, potential robotics. So he's been watching a lot of podcasts recently, and it's been, he's been seeing things that says that what's the point of going to college, and what's the point of doing anything? He's interested in physics, and he said, AI is going to largely rob us of our ability to be able to do something creative and meaningful, and especially in the STEM area, because things like physics and coding and computer science, all those things will be largely AI driven. So this is causing me some concern about what the future means for my sons. And so I find myself thinking about the utility and value of things.
Yeah. So when you are sitting with your son, Hunter, you said, right?
Yes.
And he brings up these issues, and you start to get worried, and you start to get anxious about it. What part of what he says, what part of that conversation do you find yourself zeroing in on the most and seems to be contributing to the anxiety most, or is most related to that anxiety?
That I can't adequately equip him for a future where he's safe. And education was always the thing that I thought would protect him. And now I'm like, yeah, because there were certain fields that you could think of that would have brought protection for him. And so I feel some level of like, I don't know what the future will be for him. It's a different time.
Yeah. So if I get this straight, tell me if I've got it wrong, is when you think about that, what you zero in on is not being able to protect him in that future. So you're kind of perceiving that what you think is an inability to protect him is kind of the threat that you're dealing with right now.
Yes. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. That's the thing.
And let me ask you, this may seem like a strange question, and when you do experience that anxiety, does that get in the way of anything, any goals that you have? When you kind of focus on that anxiety, does it interfere at all in the relationship, or does it interfere with you doing other things that are valuable to you?
No, I'm still able to enjoy other things and engage in other things, but so I can compartmentalize it in such a way
Yeah.
that, um, but if I think about it, I find myself getting more anxious.
Hmm. And does being when you think about it and you're getting that anxious, does that take time away from other things you'd rather be doing than sitting around being anxious?
It does.
Okay.
It does take away from time from other
Okay.
things.
Okay. And so, so it does seem to the anxiety seems to be getting in the way of somewhat, right? But
Yes.
you do compartmentalize. Um, what would be your goal? What would you like to experience rather than anxiety
I
when
would
he
like
brings this up and you're talking to him?
um, I'd like to have a sense of feeling calm and confident and capable. Capable. Yeah.
Okay. Now that seems, yeah, like a little bit longer term goal. But if you're seeing this as a threat, um, what would be a step toward that calm? And you're not going to be really calm when you're perceiving this as a threat, right?
Yeah.
So
No,
what would be an emotion that you might have that would be moving in the direction of calmness, but it wouldn't initially be calm?
not initially calm. Yeah. I wish I could arrive at the state of being the Buddha. If you could help me do that, that would be
Would it be
amazing.
not? Wouldn't it be nice? Yeah.
Um, so I would like to feel maybe because it's anxiety provoking, but
Yeah.
maybe if I could feel less anxious and more measured in that moment, and where I could have a little more confidence,
Ah,
and that would help me in that moment if I could feel. And I guess maybe if I could reframe this, 10 years ago, when he was younger, when he was 6 years old, I would oftentimes, and I've given talks about this and said, one of the goals of being a parent is to teach my boys to be able to survive in my absence. So when I die, they don't have to die with me. So
yeah.
that is the sense that it feels like it's being pulled away from me a little bit, because I always thought to myself, one of the tools is to give them an education, a career or something they could be successful. And I don't know what that landscape looks like, and so it makes me uncomfortable. So if I could move towards having a little, maybe not anxiety, but a step in the right direction, would be that I feel that it's a measurable amount, or a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Okay. So
yeah,
instead of seeing this as a huge threat, that
yes,
you would see it as a challenge. Some people, and you tell me, some people would say instead of anxiety, then I would feel concerned, but when I'm concerned about it, I still am able to,
yeah.
not see this as overwhelming. Does that make any sense at all? Can you relate?
Concerned would be great. That'd be a
Yeah.
good step in the right direction. Yeah.
So if you felt that concern, what would you be doing differently than what you do now?
What I do now is I usually eat a cinnamon roll, and I do some level of saying, "Don't worry about it. Everything's amazing. You're great. Everything's great." And even though I don't feel that,
Yeah.
so I think if I could move in a direction of concern, I could bring a little more curiosity to it.
Oh, you would be curious. And
Yeah.
that curiosity would not be there when you were anxious?
No, when I'm anxious, I'm not curious. I'm
Ah,
avoidant.
so you tend to find curiosity really helpful in those situations where there's a threat, because then you can reduce the threat down to a challenge.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's how that okay, that's really helpful for me to understand. Now, let's go back to when Hunter's in front of you and he's talking about this and he's anxious or concerned or curious or whatever it is, and you start feeling the anxiety come up. What are some of the thoughts that you start having as that anxiety starts to come up?
Um, that I won't have prepared him to be able to survive in my absence, and I start to um, overgeneralize that threat
Mhm.
and start to see it spreading to every aspect of not just his life, but everybody that I all of a sudden it can spiral.
Yeah. Yeah. So, let me get this straight. You start thinking that you would not be able to help him, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Let's say that's true. Let's say you aren't able to help him, and you cannot protect him in there. What about that will cause anxiety? What do you tell yourself about that? You know, that you wouldn't
Oh,
be able to do it, that would cause anxiety.
oh yeah. If I couldn't do that, what
Yeah,
about that?
yeah.
It makes me feel really vulnerable in that
Mhm.
moment because I have largely tasked myself with the job of keeping my family safe, and so this feels like a kind of a larger, more global sense that, oh, do I have the tools and skills that I need as a father? And so then it feels much deeper than that for me.
Well, let's go there. What would that deeper be? Do you have a word for that? You would be what?
Inadequate.
You would be utterly inadequate? Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah. So
Heavy.
in yeah, go ahead, please.
Yo, yeah, no, and that's a heavy feeling because then I start to think like, geez, what am I doing? Do I know how to parent? And then it just becomes
Uh, all kinds of self-doubt.
all this doubt starts to creep in. Yeah.
And so this is an important role for you, you being a father, right?
It's powerful. Yeah.
And you've kind of got this demand on yourself that part of that role is you keep people safe, especially your children.
Yeah. So this is an important role to keep them safe.
So you turn that desire to keep them safe, in a good value, but you escalate it up to a demand that that's something that you have to do.
Correct. Yeah.
And if you don't, then what was the word that you used to beat up on yourself? Utterly inadequate?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
A
you're like a
complete.
failure at a dad.
Yes.
Okay, okay. Um, and this may sound like a strange question. One, how helpful is it to declare helpful to you toward reaching your goal of, doing those dad duties? How helpful
Mhm.
is it for you to tell yourself that you would be utterly inadequate?
Oh, it's not helpful at all.
No, in fact, what does that get you?
It actually moves me in the direction of being frozen. Yeah.
Frozen
Yeah.
and not being able to do much of anything. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is that impediment that comes up that you have rather than helping you reach the goal, it's kind of helping you sabotage that goal, right?
Yes.
Did
Yeah.
I am I wrong or
No, no, you're completely right. So once it starts to head, it actually starts to manifest or reinforce that, and because those beliefs, so they they actually move me in the direction of actually being that thing I don't want to be.
oh, say more. That's very interesting because you put that demand on yourself. And
Yeah.
if you don't live up to the demand, you put yourself down as utterly inadequate. And that has you that doesn't get you what you want. In fact, it does the opposite. Can you describe what that is that you do?
Yeah, it will lead to a place of feeling I get frozen and
Was it
avoidant and avoidant to the point where I'm not collaborative in solving the
ah,
challenge.
oh, interesting. Because you're avoiding what? When you say avoiding, what are you avoiding?
Uncomfortable feelings.
You don't want to go to those uncomfortable feelings. But if you don't go to that discomfort,
Correct.
where does it leave you?
It leaves me not being able to do the things that make him or help him feel like he has some tools to be able to navigate these challenges.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask another question. And so we know that you kind of globally rate yourself in a negative way, right? And
Yeah.
when that comes up, but we also found out that you do have this demand that you put on yourself that you must, prepare those, your boys to be able to navigate in this world competently and safely, right? And so, how is putting that utter demand upon yourself helpful? I understand having that as a value and a very important desire of yours. But when you escalate that up to a demand, how does that help you?
It doesn't help me.
Can you say a little bit more? It doesn't help you in what way?
Well, when I make it a demand, it does shut down my ability to perform, and because it does feel overwhelming when it's I set this all or nothing, where either I am able to do this or instead of having some degrees of success of navigating these challenges.
Ah, okay. Yeah, so it absolutizes it, kind
Yes.
of. Yeah, I
Yeah.
get it. I get it. So, would you like to talk about what you might be able to think that might be more adaptive, rather than putting a demand on yourself and thinking, hey, I'm just going to be a complete and utter, I don't know, what was the word? Failure,
Failure.
incompetent. Okay. Um, so let me ask you a question. Let's say you had a friend who was going through exactly the same thing that you're going through. Because I'm sure you're not the first person in the world who wants to to interact with his son and to keep them, safe and to navigate the world competently, right? So they can do it when you're gone, and they can do the same thing for their children, etc. So, um, what could you what would be something you could tell yourself that, well, let me go back to the friend thing. If you had a friend who was in that very same situation, right?
Mhm.
And they said, when I think, I gotta make them feel safe. And if I don't, I'm a complete loser. What would you say to them? Would you say, yeah, I've been meaning to tell you, I've never met someone as big of a loser as you? Would you say that to them?
I I probably wouldn't hold on to friends for long
Yeah, right. So why wouldn't you say that to them?
because it would not be true.
It wouldn't be true. Would it be helpful for you to say, look, what I've been meaning to tell you, are nothing but a big loser when it comes to being a dad?
It would not be helpful.
Okay. As you said, you would have very many friends if you did that. So it's interesting. You wouldn't do it to a friend, but you would do it to yourself.
Yes. Yes. Yep.
Is there a different set of rules in the universe that apply to you, but not your friends?
No, there shouldn't be, but it's interesting. It's easier for me to examine or help others,
Yeah.
and to look at ways of taking whatever the challenge they may have outside of them as a person,
Mm.
so we could look at it, um, versus me not collapsing my performance to my sense of self, how I
Ah,
perform. Yeah,
yeah. I think that's pretty common, right? Don't you know a lot of people that kind of do that?
I do.
Yeah. So, so it's not really helpful for you to make this big declaration. You're aware that it's not really helpful. So, what might be something you could tell yourself in a situation your son is coming to you and suddenly you're like, oh, man, um, this is a big threat. I'm supposed to keep him safe. I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep him safe and competent. What would be something you could tell yourself about that interaction that would be more helpful than, I'm just a loser?
I um I I think a more helpful thing would be to, in that moment, remind myself that, while he's 16 and I don't have sufficient evidence that I am a failure, that he's been doing quite well in life, and I have been.
Mm.
And even having him come to me and ask those questions with real curiosity means that at some level I've been successful because I have
Yeah.
a son who's exploring his life and feels safe enough to seek me out. And so the 16 years of success and evidence might be something I could look at. Yeah.
Mhm. Isn't it interesting that you only see that, you only focus that when you move away from that global negative rating of yourself?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And only in that moment can I actually have a larger understanding of the narrative or the history of the story. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Does that decrease the threat?
Quite a bit, because then I'm able to examine in that moment other challenges I've faced as a father, and then once I start to do that, I can start to examine other challenges I've had in general in other relationships or
Yeah. Yeah.
other parts of my life,
Yeah.
and then that too gives me some level of freedom in that moment.
That's interesting, really. Yeah. And if we go to that other belief, that demand that you have, I mean, because you have a great desire.
Mm.
What father, what good father, or what good parent doesn't want to, keep the world safe for their children, and so that they're productive and do well in life when we're gone. Um, but that you found that the demand doesn't help, right?
Mm.
Yeah. So again, what could you put in the place of that demand? I absolutely must make his life non-threatening,
Yes,
right?
uh, it's
Absolutely safe. I have to guarantee that.
that's that's been a challenging thing well before now, well before now. I I think that allowing my son to have the challenges and the bumps and bruises of life has been something that's difficult. But I have seen where other parents haven't allowed that into their children's lives,
Ah,
and it has been a disaster. If the kid can't face adversity, and whatever that may mean, and I know for the future it's difficult for us to predict. But if I could substitute the belief that I must keep them safe instead of that I must, or maybe even get rid of the word must, that I have given them the abilities to be able to handle some adversity. That I want them to be able to have those tools to handle some challenges, and not just keep the world safe for them because safe is uh, is an illusion. Yeah.
mm. So that even if you put the demand on yourself, you're not actually helping them in the long run.
No, not at all. When he was born and started to ambulate, I bought him a walking helmet, and uh,
Yeah, yeah.
and, and those walking helmets were purely geared towards people with this expectation that they had to make the world uh, uh, completely benign and safe at all times, and not realizing that children had been born into a world with the ability to be able to ambulate with the expectation that all walking has necessity of falls. And I didn't appreciate that learning to walk required the ability to handle the fall. Instead, I just wanted to remove the fall from the walking by adding the helmet. And I never got the helmet on him in time. He always fell, then I was like, oh, then I ran for the helmet. And there was a powerful lesson in that. And it's been hard for me to not want to keep the idea of the helmet in place.
Ah, that's like a metaphor, right?
It is a metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so those little bumps that he would get on his head from falling, um, they were required as a part of the process of learning to walk. And I just wanted to remove those little bumps because they were so pain. They were more painful for me, perhaps.
Yeah.
'Cause he cried for 10 seconds, and I felt uncomfortable, catastrophizing that there was a major brain bleed happening in that moment, not realizing the fall was from a relatively small height from a small being. And yeah.
So because if I got it straight, because you saw that fall as a threat
Mhm.
rather than just part of the learning process of walking.
Yeah. Yeah.
How is it different if you see it as a learning process rather than this big threat? I mean, you're a physician, so you're going to think about brain bleeds and all that kind of stuff, right? But what if you see it as learning process?
If I see it as a part of a learning process and not an it makes it much more manageable,
Yeah,
and then I start to conceptualize it in a better way.
I see.
If I start to think about it that way, that that the that these bumps and bruises that all of us will face is the part of the maturation or part of the a part of a necessity to be able to be strong and independent.
Mm,
Yeah.
mhm, yeah. And that in fact, it sounds like you said it became more manageable. So instead of seeing this as like this huge, overwhelming threat, right?
Yeah.
That's out there that you got to make safe for them, it becomes a manageable threat. And when you saw it as a manageable, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so please correct me. When you saw it as a manageable threat, then you were also able to see it as a learning experience that you didn't see when you saw it as overwhelming threat.
It is true. I saw it as a learning experience, and and interestingly enough, for my second child, he had no helmet. I was well aware that he will. So the experience of seeing the first go through with the second had complete freedom to fall, and with the expectation that the fall was required to learn to walk.
I have a
And
question.
yeah,
What if you took the same attitude that there's always a potential threat, right?
mm,
But likelihood and whether it's manageable is different than an overwhelming threat. And what if you took that into the conversation when you have with your son who's
mm,
worrying about his future in the presence of AI? How might you respond differently instead of
mm.
moving to the anxiety?
I think it would be a much better solution for me to be able to bring that to those moments where he's because perhaps in those moments he might be asking me, and if I brought some curiosity to the question, that sometimes when he's talking to me, or perhaps when other people are even talking to us, but him, he may be asking me a different question, and I
Mm.
may be answering. I may be taking the question literally, and I'm not saying there's not value in the literal question, but
Ah,
he might be asking me a question about being 16 and what does it mean to be 2 years away from going off to college, and what does it mean to be no longer in my father's house? And that might be the conversation that we're really having in that moment, and so some curiosity around that. And to ask him how he feels about that place might be a good place to begin.
which was that issue of curiosity.
Yeah.
Um, it's really interesting as you said that. And again, let me see if I don't have this right, then just
Mm,
correct me, please. And that is, um, you gave a meaning to when he's telling you, when
mm,
he's talking about his concerns. You gave it a meaning that potentially he's seen as a threat, as you are seen as a threat. And then, well, if you get curious, you may go, oh, I wonder what it really means in this moment, rather than rushing to that one.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. That he may be asking me something else in that moment, and
Mhm.
helping him maybe the curiosity would allow me to instead of trying to solve the problem
Mhm.
of the falls, of the bumps, that I just have some curiosity in that moment and ask him a question in that moment to say, "Is there something else you may be concerned about? Is there something else that's coming up?"
Yeah.
And yeah,
And if you did that, what would you be modeling for him that you wouldn't be modeling when you think you have to absolutely keep himself and you're a failure if you don't?
would be modeling the ability to be able to handle those challenges in
Mhm.
a way that is not just curious, but is really thoughtful and not just reactive,
Mm.
but um, deliberate. You know,
So if I got it right, so you're really modeling for him how to look at different potential meanings, be flexible, and to realize, yeah, you can handle this.
yes,
Would that be something that you would like for him to learn?
and that might be a better tool than for him to have. Yeah, the
Okay.
ability. Yeah,
Yeah. So, and you can do that without causing the pressure of your demand upon yourself and declaring yourself to be an utter failure and loser or whatever as a dad, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. So let's. I'm going to ask you strange question. We've already found out that the demand doesn't help you, and that globally rating yourself and putting yourself down doesn't help you. You wouldn't even do it for a friend, but you're doing it to yourself sometimes. But
mm,
that it would help if you pulled back and became curious about it
mm,
and realize that the meaning you're giving to it may not be the same as the meaning your son is giving to it. Okay. So we have it. So, what would be something you can do the next time? Because you're going to have more conversations because AI is advancing, right? So, the next time Hunter brings this up, what could you do in that moment where you would bring in these insights, right? What could you do? What could you tell yourself so you don't just jump on the anxiety train?
I think one thing I could tell myself is that this situation, it's not as novel as I had once thought.
Hmm.
That
Oh,
I've seen this before, and I think that sometimes for me, um, the situations can seem novel, and I don't see how they're very similar to other situations, and uh, and I've been able to have some insight and lessons in the past that I may not be applying, or some tools that I have from the past that I could apply. So much like the walking helmet, the insights from that apply to this, and that I can now bring history to this.
yeah,
And I think the challenge has been that when the threat feels bigger, I lose the insight of seeing how the situation is very similar.
I see. So there's this bigger story that you can tap into.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm. And that story has other themes in it other
Mhm.
than I'm a failure and I have to be the grand protector of, my complete and total complete and total safety for my children.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. And that sounds like that those bigger themes are more helpful for you. I've
Much
been
more.
here. I've done this. It didn't kill me and it didn't harm my children, right? Those kinds of, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, we're nearing the end, although it's gone, pretty. It's been a short kind of a session. So we have kind of a way that we can go about it, so that I tend to go in this situation now. I have a broader repertoire, and I can tap into a larger narrative that doesn't end up having me be a failure. Um, Knowing what you know about yourself, how would you sabotage this? You know what I mean? And just go with that interpretation. You go with the demand and you go with the global negative rating. How would you sabotage yourself and just go with that rather than those that are helpful?
I it's it's interesting. I find that I will revert back to these overwhelming places of threat when other areas of my life may not be as coming together or feel safe.
Ah,
So if if I'm not taking care of myself in other domains, like whether I'm not sleeping well or eating well or even going to the gym, that I can start to perceive threat in every domain of my life by not having and maintaining a routine. So the necessity of routine is so important to make me, or not to make. And there I was, to help me be able to be less uh, overwhelmed by threat.
Mm,
If I just dial into that, there are a certain set of practices that allow me to do better in life,
yeah.
and so that's it. And I know those things, but yeah,
What would help you remember that in the moment?
yeah. Well, if you could call me, that would be.
There's a small fee for that, Dr. Peacock, you know.
um,
Uh, yeah,
j- j-
wouldn't it be nice if we had somebody that did that for us?
just to call me in a moment when I'm
Yeah,
starting to. Um, I have been able to,
you
at
have been.
times. Yeah, and I think that when I start to feel the sensation of feeling uncomfortable or anxious, to use as a cue is
Ah,
one tool that, if I feel myself feeling uncomfortable, and then to allow myself to realize like, "Oh, here is the moment where I start down that pathway," and to break that pattern early, is, one technique that I could really do.
okay. So you do have a mechanism there. You can tap into that, and that can put you in a different place. And you know what? It's interesting when you say that. It is to become curious about your discomfort, right? So that asset of becoming curious about things, kind of like what Freud said, develop this observer self.
Mm,
I'm not Freudian, but I love that idea of developing an observer self, and that will prevent you from just going on the anxiety train and that kind of thing. Yeah. So it sounds like you have a backup plan that you could tap into. So is there anything that you wanted to bring up that I didn't cover or I failed to cover adequately?
no, I think this is great, and in the process of doing this, I started to learn a lot and see that what I thought was a unique event was really a repetition of earlier patterns of feeling threat,
Mm,
and that I've been through it before, and I can handle it again. And so that was unique to go all the way back to the birth of the sun, to
yeah.
see how I've had those spikes in threat, and then I've had overwhelming threat with a poor intervention because I've globally miss I made an attribution of too much threat. Um, and instead of trying to avoid it and to see it with some curiosity has always been the solution in the past.
Yeah.
So that's been really good for today for me to see that I can approach these situations with real curiosity. And only in that space have I been successful in the past with that curiosity.
I appreciate that because what you seem to be saying is that when you avoid it, you kind of fixate right there, right? That
Mhm.
you're kind of stuck, right? And the only reason you avoid it is because you're still seen as this overwhelming threat rather than a learning opportunity, etc.
And I think the other key insight that I got today was that sometimes when I see something or label it as the source of threat, it may
Mhm.
not actually be the source of threat.
Ah,
And when he's talking about AI, I might be in the future, what I might be feeling, I have a sophomore in high school,
yeah,
and I have 2 more years before he's off. And what does that mean? And we may not be talking about that. We may be talking about something else. What does it mean for a father to be able to transition to a son who's no longer necessarily living in the house? And what does that mean? So I think those were really interesting insights today.
that's interesting too because if I got it, it seems like you're putting this event into a larger context, part of a developmental context, right?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That seems to be really, really helpful. I have one other thing to run by you, and that it looks as though in those times when you uh, um, have this demand upon yourself and this global negative rating of yourself, when you don't live up to your demand, you kind of you identify with being a loser there. I'm wondering if we think about being a father as a role, a very, very important role. Probably you would have it way up at the top of the list of the roles that you have, the many roles that you have in life. And in that role, that you refrain from evaluating yourself, you just evaluate your performance within that role. I think I did fairly well in that conversation. Or, yeah, this conversation kind of sucked. Let me see if I need to kind of improve that a little bit. You know what I mean? But not globally rate yourself. Just go, okay, this was pretty good. I could have done better here. What would that be like for you instead of globally rating the self?
I think that would be it'd be wonderful. Instead of, because when I see myself as a complete failure in one domain, it does shape or create a lens over which I see other aspects of my life. And so it can impact me in those moments where I
Yeah.
start to question my skill set everywhere.
Yeah.
And so it's it's important to not do that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you. I hope it was interesting for you, and it was interesting for me. I want to open it up to anybody who's here. If you have any questions, comments, please feel free to do it. The comments that I got so far have just been good morning, thank you, and so that's very nice. We're happy that you all came. Someone said the walking helmet analogy was great. When did you realize to use that emotional and behavioral goal, right? So this is really interesting. The walking helmet analogy was Dr. Peacock's. And so I just confirmed that, oh yeah, this seems to be a metaphor for things. And he acknowledged that. And so I just did it because I was confirming what Dr. Peacock did. Emotional and behavioral goals. Yeah, we got an emotional goal, right? And we got behavioral goals. The emotional goal was really to shift from that anxiety over to something like concern, and that was involved in that is the shift from the perception of overwhelming threat to something that was more manageable threat. And that once an individual was able to do that, then we can dig into that just a little further, and even work out a behavioral goal, because his behavior was what? Avoidance. And so we had him move towards something rather than move away from it. Once he was able to do that, he figured it out. I was just here to witness him figuring it all out, and I could just see the cogs in his head churning. He was, as soon as he got the insight, he was beginning to see the implications of that. For many of our clients, we'll see that. Some other clients, we may not see that. It's nice that Dr. Peacock's a psychiatrist. He was on top of that, and so we're really, excited about that. Someone said, what potential homework would you give a client in this scenario? Well, kind of did this at the end. I didn't call it a homework, but I was saying, what if in the next time you're in a situation like that, you think about your goal as a parent, and then you look at, how was I moving toward that goal in this interaction, or was I moving away from it? But would do that without a global evaluation of the self, either as wonderful or a total failure, right? And so then that, if they can learn that, evaluate the behavior, but not the self, then we often get much more help for the client. It is that global negative rating that messes us up. When we feel like a failure, we're less motivated. A lot of people think that if I beat myself up, I'm more motivated, but it tends to have the opposite consequence. But do you find that, Dr. Peacock? I mean,
I do.
you don't get anything great out of beating up on yourself, do you?
I really don't.
No. Yeah. So, someone said, beautiful presentation. Is there any chance that he has a meta emotion like anxiety for feeling anxiety? I didn't go into that because I wanted to keep it short, but it would be a very, very good question. And so I could ask Dr. Peacock right now, when you get anxious, do you tend to have any emotion about your anxiety?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And what
I
is
get
that
ang-
emotion?
I get anxious about being anxious.
Okay, that's a good one. And now it's like, oh, isn't anxiety enough? Now we get to be anxious about anxiety. And sometimes if we really let that go over a long period of time and ruminate or perseverate, we call that panic, right? And so, yeah, that is really, and usually in a normal session where I've got more time, I will always check about a meta disturbance. Okay. Someone said, I really like that you ask him how he might sabotage himself in these situations. Would that also be something that you would follow up with him about in future sessions as well? Well, I might not start the next session and say, how did you sabotage yourself? But I would get to it in a different way by saying, one would be, did you have any thoughts about how that went? Tell me what went well in any conversation you may have had in the week. Why would I ask that? I tend not to want to focus just on what they're seeing as a failure. You see what I mean? Because I'm just emphasizing them looking for mistakes in their interactions. Where I want them to be more biased towards seeing when things go well, right? And build upon them going well. Will I do that all the time? No, at times, especially early on in therapy, I may, have them track their anxiety, but I try to get off that as quickly as possible because I want them to learn more than being a police officer for their anxiety, right? Or a detective for their anxiety. I would love for them to be a detective on what's going well in their interactions with people and how they're using those resources. So what I might do with Dr. Peacock, and I'm going to ask him right now what that would be like, is Dr. Peacock, if in the next session I had with you, I would say, how was being curious in conversations with your son? How did that go with you in any conversation you with him? What would that be like rather than me going, when did you have any anxious conversations with your son? What would be the difference for you if I did that?
Tremendous, because curiosity would move me. If you asked that question, it
Yeah.
would move towards being able to detect or those moments where I was able to be present for my son. And and when I'm and when you're anxious, it moves you into a place where you're not just potentially overwhelmed, but where you're not present, and it shifts you. And so that that's a great that's a great technique. And I and as you bring curiosity, like you had mentioned about the curiosity around anxiety, um, I find interesting and a wonderful thing to even be curious about. Is it possible in that moment there might be some other reason I'm having those sensations that may
Ah,
not be like, is it possible that what I call anxiety is something else? Like, are you so in that moment you're calling it anxiety? Like, hmm. Just to even be curious about what I'm calling anxiety.
that's very interesting. Now, that's a little outside REBT, but what we do know, and I love what Dr. Peacock is saying, is that, and we will often do this, is um, emotions are complex And the interesting thing about emotions is these are labels that we give to experiences, right? That we have, especially bodily sensations and experiences. And sometimes in a different setting, what the physiological arousal that we call anxiety in a different setting, we would call excitement, right? Now, let me preface this with saying there's no way you would get me on a roller coaster. I think of them as death traps. I'm not going on them, okay? But I remember when I was young and I loved going on roller coasters. It's kind of the same level of excitement, but the same physiological arousal. I called excitement there, but in another setting, when I was young, if I was going to ask a young lady out for a date, I called that anxiety, right? And I got over that. I began to see there was threat and opportunity, and eventually opportunity won on those kinds of things. But you see what I mean? In a different context, the same level of physiological arousal would be labeled differently. And if we learn just that, we can become curious about that, right? And not go on a big anxiety ride.
I like that. It's as you were talking, and we've talked about this before about how, as I was drinking my coffee, that we often will have people come to me or you or somebody and say, "I drink coffee and I feel anxious," and
Yeah.
and that's a label for that arousal that they've decided to say coffee makes me anxious instead of that curiosity about the stimulant properties of the caffeine, which is interesting. So yeah, I like curiosity.
I think that is a big key. And if we can help our clients to develop that curiosity about what they're going through and become curious about the story that they're creating it, and that if we come up with other stories that kind of challenge that story that may lead to discomfort, then that can be really powerful. Let me see. Someone else said, "What does breaking the pattern of feeling uncomfortable look like when another conversation like this comes up with his son? Is that something we can mention in a session? Is that more CBT or REBT?" So, did you get that the question, Dr. Peacock? So, you have any comment on that?
Yeah. So one technique that has helped me, maybe not in this area, but I have used successfully in other areas, is to remember a time in which I've had taken on the a challenge that has been much more overwhelming for me. And yet, in spite of that challenge, I've been able to be successful to navigate that. And so and then to ask myself, is this day that day is a powerful pattern break for me.
Yeah,
And the example I often give is the day that I had to face the death of my father.
yeah.
And then, so that's a rapid break. Is this that day? And so, talking to my son about navigating the challenges of his future is not the same challenge as facing the death of my father. And so that immediately breaks the pattern to know that I was strong enough to show up for that day. I can show up for this day. So I like the idea. And that was a great question about breaking patterns.
And so the person said, "Is that more CBT or REBT?" I think both models deal with this. And one thing, for example, let me take REBT. When something like anxiety comes up in the conceptualization of anxiety, we would say that the inference is making an attribution of threat in the environment. And that was what was behind the questions that I was asking Dr. Peacock. And then we would tend to spend more time looking at the dysfunctional beliefs. Um, and however, there are those of us within REBT, and CBT certainly does this, is to look at the functionality of that inference, of always looking at something as an overwhelming threat. We do challenge it at the level of inference. We'll also challenge it at the level of belief. Oh, the next person asked a question that I know I'm really quite interested in. It says, Lisa Feldman Barrett has something similar. If you're curious about the physical sensations, you can attach another meaning to them and transform the emotion from anxiety, for example, into concern. Absolutely. And I love the work of Dr. Barrett, and we see that within second and third wave models, a similar kind of awareness. So yeah, I do love her work. And the work of Dr. Barrett, right, Larry?
Yeah. The when she her work is fascinating and great and groundbreaking in many ways, because the word is interoception, the sensation of, because people have a sense of feeling, but they feel their internal sensations, and they make a cognitive guess. They make a guess about what that emotional sensation is, and we make bad guesses. And so the curiosity allows us to make a less bad guess, because that sympathetic arousal can be caused by any number of things, from a viral illness to anxiety to excitement. And so Barrett, her research is amazing and challenging.
So does anybody, we still have time for another question or two if anybody has them. It's been, I have to say, the questions that people asked today were spot on and just wonderful, wonderful questions. Yeah. Well, if not, I want to thank you, Dr. Peacock, for giving your time away from the cold of Maine to come and to talk with us. And I want to thank everybody who came on a Saturday morning when there are so many things you could be doing other than listening to me do a therapy session. But I deeply appreciate all of you. I do want to make an announcement of something that I'm creating, and I will be putting it on my YouTube channel, which is Psychotherapy Education and Training. And that is any of you that have learned or are learning REBT and would like to join a group when we practice these skills with each other, and so that we can all learn together and come up with even more techniques. That would be fantastic. I will be announcing that and making that available to people. Okay, so thank you so much. Please hop on the channel and consider joining us when we do announce that. Again, Dr. Peacock, have a great weekend, and
Thank you.
we'll talk soon. Bye-bye, everybody.